So once again, thank you everyone for joining us. This is our Lunch and Learn on mandatory minimums and congressional threats to DC. I'm Darby Hickey, Senior Policy Counsel at DC Justice Lab, and I'm joined here by my excellent colleague, Ashley Anderson, Policy Counsel at DC Justice Lab, who's going to be co-presenting. We've also got our Policy Director, Bethany Young, on helping us out. And thanks to all of y'all for taking time out of your day to join us. Unfortunately, our CEO, Clinique Chapman, couldn't join us today, but she sends her warm regards and thanks you all for taking the time to join us and for supporting this important work and sharing information out with the community. I want to go through briefly the agenda we're going to have today. I want to talk about why this matters now, what the urgency is. Then we'll get into the harms of mandatory minimums. Then we'll go over the bills in Congress, and we'll have some time for question and answer, followed by a quick review of what's coming next and what to look out for. So with that, why now? Why are we talking about mandatory minimums and congressional threats right now? Well, we at DC Justice Lab talk about mandatory minimums a lot because they're an example of a very failed policy that does not promote public safety while in fact increasing mass incarceration and racial inequality. But, that's all the time that we talk about it. Right now, the reason we're talking about it is there are a number of bills in Congress that would either increase or add new mandatory minimums to DC laws or remove some of the laws that we've implemented over the years to reduce the harms of mandatory minimums. These are commonly kind of called escape valves that are a policy approach that in a kind of conversely to mandatory minimums, which Ashley will talk a little bit more about, have pretty universal consensus around that they're not very effective. These escape valves have pretty wide acceptance as one way to mitigate the harm from mandatory minimums. Obviously, outright removing mandatory minimums from the laws is even better, but those escape valves are important. So there are three bills that deal with mandatory minimums in the Congress. One of them is explicitly about them, and the other two deal more with that escape valve piece I was talking about. First, we have the legislation that would actually increase some of our current mandatory minimums or add new ones. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into all three of these, just giving a quick overview here. That bill that bill is only in the House, and it's been voted out of committee, and so the next step for it is to get a vote in the full House. And that is well, I'm blanking on the name right now, but the number is right there. The next one we're going to talk about today is a bill that has a companion both in the House and in the Senate called the DC Crimes Act. And what this would do would, among other things, is remove the provision in the Youth Rehabilitation Act that allows judges discretion to sentence below mandatory minimums for certain young adults. And then lastly is a bill, again, there's a companion both in the House and Senate focused on repealing in its entirety the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act. That relationship to mandatory minimums is that it does allow, Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act does allow folks to petition to shorten very long sentences after proving rehabilitation and that they're not a threat to public safety. Again, that could be a way to shorten a mandatory minimum sentence. But as I mentioned, we're going to jump more in depth into all three of those, just wanting to lay those out. I'll also mention here that while Congress can legislate, can repeal any of our laws, can rewrite any of our laws, they also can interfere with us through our budget process. And although this is not currently a threat, it's just, I want to put it on folks' radar. There was previously a proposal to include the provisions around the DC Crimes Act, around the YRA, in a budget rider on our budget, saying that we couldn't spend any money on that. Not really sure how that would play out realistically or practically, but that is always another kind of policy that's another approach they can take to changing our policies in DC, enforcing policies on us, is saying that we're not allowed to spend money in our local budget with our local taxes on XYZ policy, in this case, um, implementing the Youth Rehabilitation Act. Like I said, that's actually, that did not make it through the process, but just something to be aware of and thoughtful about. The other interesting, I'll talk a little bit more about all of these later, but the other thing just to keep in mind here is that these are all bills in the Senate. These are not disapproval resolutions, which we just had dealt with recently in DC, and which does have a slightly different procedural process or procedural stance that allows it to move more quickly and without the filibuster. All three of these would in fact be subject to the filibuster. So with that, I will turn it over to Ashley to talk a little bit about the harms and efficacy of mandatory minimums.
Thank you, Darby, and hello again, everybody. It's great to be with y'all this afternoon. And I am going to talk about mandatory minimums. And I think the main takeaway that you should leave from this section is that mandatory minimums are harmful and they're not effective for public safety. So, for those who don't know, a mandatory minimum is a sentence that a judge must give for certain convictions and the minimum amount a person found guilty of an offense must serve. In mandatory minimums, there is an abundance of research that shows they do not improve public safety, and studies that confirm that mandatory minimums do not reduce recidivism. And research shows that increasing the severity of punishment does very little to deter crime. And so, when you have laws and policies that are designed to deter crime by focusing mainly on increasing the severity of punishment, they're mainly ineffective because these individuals know very little about the sanctions of specific crimes. So, it's not really doing anything to improve our public safety. Mandatory minimums can also lead to very extreme sentences, which force judges to impose long sentences regardless of the individual circumstances of each case or community safety. And when courts aren't bound by mandatory minimums, they're required by law to consider various factors in sentencing, which include the perspectives of victims and also the specifics to that individual case. But when you have mandatory minimums, they remove this discretion from judges and force them to impose long sentences, regardless again of the individual circumstances or community safety. This is also a big reason why victim advocacy organizations in DC reject the use of mandatory minimums. And they argue that eliminating mandatory minimums protects victims' rights and responsibilities as sentencing. And on this point, I want to emphasize that this is also a way that prosecutors have leveraged to coerce defendants into plea bargains, because if they refuse, it means that they could face the mandatory minimum. Mandatory minimums also do not necessarily target the most serious conduct, but even when they are applied to serious crimes, they can lead to a lot of unjust outcomes. And it's very important that when the stakes are the highest, that judges are able to consider the individual circumstances of each case. For example, the mandatory minimum for homicide has impacted people who were abused or who were victims of sex trafficking. And when you eliminate mandatory minimums, it protects victims who commit crimes against their abusers who have caused them harm and allows courts to consider those mitigating circumstances. Next slide, please. Also, want to share that disproportionately, Black people in DC account for 9 out of 10 people who are sentenced under mandatory minimums. And in DC, 1 in 5 sentences are mandatory. But with that, there is broad consensus among experts and stakeholders and also DC residents that we need to eliminate mandatory minimum. Legal experts like the American Law Institute, the American Bar Association, and the Federal Judicial Conference recommend that there should be no mandatory minimums for any offense. And 77% of DC residents across all 8 wards agree to eliminate mandatory minimums. So this is something that DC residents across all 8 wards, majority do not want to see in the district. And I want to end by stating that 2/3 of states across the United States have eliminated some mandatory minimums. With that, just to want to end by saying again, take anything away from this, that mandatory minimums, they're harmful to the DC community and they're ineffective for public safety. And now I want to pass it over to Darby to talk a little bit more about the history of mandatory minimums in DC.
Thanks so much, Ashley. I think because of that widespread consensus around the fact that mandatory minimums are not effective at promoting public safety and actually increase mass incarceration, increase racial disparities in incarceration, that's why so many places, including DC, have attempted to remove them from the law. And we've done that in DC. And I say attempted because we actually did do that, but then Congress intervened, and that was what happened with the Revised Criminal Code Act of 2022, which came out of the Criminal Code Reform Commission. That was a body, a government body, including legal experts, prosecutors, public defenders, that consulted quite extensively with the community over the period of 16 years. And the goal here was to um, update DC's criminal code, which had not been comprehensively revised in over 100 years. And within that process, the commission drew on the model penal code, which includes this recommendation that, or these recommendations that Ashley was just mentioning around not having mandatory minimums in the code. Now, model penal code, it's a model. It's not completely in place anywhere, but it is drawn upon by many different states across the country when they've been revising their criminal code, just like we were trying to do here in DC. And those states span the political spectrum in terms of where they stand on various issues. So I think that once again just kind of like reinforces like this broad consensus. Yet ironically, uh, or just showing how challenging it can be in the modern era to have like evidence-based policies come into play when this law, when the Revised Criminal Code Act of 2022 was being debated around disapproval in Congress. The sentencing provisions were one of the key subjects of debate, and the idea that the revised criminal code and the misrepresentation of it as reducing penalties, as soft on crime, when really what it was about was making the code easier to understand, more sensible, and more internally consistent, more proportionate between different types of harm, that sort of thing. Those sentencing provisions really took up a lot of the oxygen in the room and led to it being disapproved on a bipartisan basis, both by Congress and the president. Why am I talking about that now? Is because that code, the Revised Criminal Code Act of 2022, removed all mandatory minimums from DC's code except for murder. Although we passed it, Congress disapproved it, therefore it is not the law, but it is clear that we in DC do not want to take this policy approach. On the other hand, it does show why this particular topic within the unfortunate wide spectrum of federal threats to DC right now might be more likely to gain traction because of this focus on it in the past. Now we're in a different moment in many different ways, so it's hard to say, of course, but we thought that this history around it was important to lift up. The other piece here that we wanted to mention is that uh, not so much the bill focused just on mandatory minimums, but the bill is focused on the Youth Rehabilitation Act and on the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act have both also been prioritized and targeted by members of the administration, of the federal administration, of the president, the U.S. Attorney for DC, some advisors to the president. And so that's another reason why we think that these bills might get more traction in amongst this, again, wide array of threats, unfortunately, that we're dealing with right now. With that, I'll pass it back over to Ashley to talk a little more specifically about these different bills.
Thank you, Darby. So, the first bill I want to talk about is the Stronger Sentences for Safer DC Streets Act. And this is the bill that is going to create new mandatory minimums while also increasing the mandatory minimum for different offenses. And so, as you can see on the slide, it creates new mandatory minimums for second-degree murder, for kidnapping, for first-degree sexual abuse, for rape. But in addition, it also increases mandatory minimum sentences for crimes such as, for example, first degree murder, that is going to be from going from 30 years to life without parole. For first degree burglary, that is going from 5 years to 10 years. For unarmed carjacking, that's going from 7 years to 10 years. From armed carjacking, that's going from 15 years to 20 years. And for rape with a prior conviction of a crime of violence, that's going from 7 years to 30 years. But I think it's also important to note that DC already has very extreme mandatory minimums compared to other states. For example, when we think about the mandatory minimum for murder, DC's right now is 30 years, but in Texas it's 5 years. Alabama, Arkansas, and Montana, it's 10 years there. In New York and Utah, it's 15. In Illinois, Kentucky, Virginia, it's 20 years. So we already have very extreme mandatory minimums already, and this is just going to increase that harm, which, as we said before, it does nothing to protect for public safety, to promote public safety, and it just causes harm for DC residents and community members while fueling mass incarceration. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this one, the DC Crimes Act of 2025, this bill would repeal a provision within the Youth Rehabilitation Act that gives judges discretion to sentence some young people and young adults under the age of 25 below a mandatory minimum. And this is very important because young people do need sentencing alternatives. There's a lot of research that talks about how they're developmentally different from older adults, and they're less able to monitor responses in emotionally charged situations. Young adults and young people are less likely to consider future consequences in decision making and more likely to experience behavioral health disorders. And so, again, like Darby said, this is removing an opportunity for people to serve less than the mandatory minimum, given the research of what it said about how this is going to impact people in our community. And then lastly, I want to talk about the Justice in DC Act. And this is the bill that would repeal the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act, also called IRA. And IRA is a pathway for individuals who are convicted of DC offenses that occurred when they were under the age of 25 to seek a modification of their sentence after 15 years of incarceration. And IRA safely returns DC residents who are in Bureau of Prison facilities all over the country back to their communities where they have shown overwhelming success. And then again, this means that a person could serve less than the mandatory minimum. So just to conclude from these three bills, we're seeing Congress is introducing bills to create new mandatory minimums and increase mandatory minimums that we already have that are already extreme, while removing those safety valves that Darby mentioned that give opportunities for people to serve less than the mandatory minimum. And then lastly, just as we shared earlier in the presentation, they're again not effective for public safety. They're harmful to the community. They only fuel mass incarceration, and the majority of DC residents do not want to see this. Back to you, Darby.
Thanks, Ashley. I'll just add one more point there, which is that in addition to what Ashley was mentioning about a number of the mandatory minimums that would be increased or created under the Stronger Sentences for Safer DC Streets Act being those ones being higher than in many other states, and some of our mandatory minimums in DC already being much higher than many other states. Actually, some of these mandatory minimums under this congressional bill would actually would make in DC the mandatory minimum would be longer than the statutory maximum for the same crime in other states, right? So you commit a crime in DC that's going to have 10 years mandatory minimum, that yet in this other state where Congress can't legislate, where Congress can't rewrite laws, can't overturn laws, where the maximum might be like 2 years, 5 years, maybe even 10 years, but that's the maximum again, rather than the minimum that's going to be allowed, which is just wild, right? And shows once again our unique situation here in DC being under the power of Congress and the president in terms of our ability to legislate and not being able to make the same choices as states, and really underscores the importance of having statehood for DC. That being said, what's coming up next with all of these? Oh, I want to mention one other thing actually about this last bill, the it's called the Justice in DC Act. The Senate version is just focused on the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act. And like I mentioned before, that's one of the priorities that we've heard coming out of the administration for repeal. And it is one of these safety valves for mitigating mandatory minimum sentences. In the House version, interestingly, the companion bill not only would repeal the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act, but would also repeal our local record sealing law and expungement law that we updated a few years ago to take us from being one of the places with the worst laws on that to one of the better ones. That particular aspect, record relief, actually has, again, pretty widespread bipartisan support. So, of course, we never know, but that might be less likely to move forward. What we could see when this one comes to the full House floor, would be it would be amended to just focus on the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act. So we'll have to keep an eye on that and see what happens. We'll likely see a vote in the House, the full House, on both that bill on 5242 as well as 5172. That's the Safer Streets for DC. That's the one about increasing and adding new mandatory minimums. Those are the two that have passed out of committee in the House, haven't had a floor vote yet. Unfortunately, most of the bills, well, not most, all of the bills targeting DC that have gotten to the House floor have passed. So we don't expect anything different to happen there. There is a question of how much of a margin do they pass by, how much bipartisan support do they get. So that can be important, but it really ends up meaning that the fight around this will be in the Senate. And as I mentioned before, because these are bills and not disapproval resolutions, they would be subject to filibuster in the Senate. So that increases the chances of defeating them. Now, if they were just passed as standalone bills and moved in the Senate as standalone bills, there actually is not really enough time in the calendar for that to happen. So that is probably not going to be how it goes, unfortunately, which would be probably an easier way to push back on them. Unfortunately, instead, what is probably going to happen is that some or all of these would be incorporated into a larger kind of omnibus crime bill coming out of the Senate, originating in the Judiciary Committee, that would include a number of these provisions to overturn or rewrite local DC laws, as well as uh, regressive changes to federal criminal laws. And potentially, in an effort to make it an even harder vote, might even include some positive reforms to federal laws. So that's probably what we're going to be looking at some point, will be a bill in the Senate that might include these new mandatory minimums, might include a repeal of IRA, might include a repeal or changes to the YRA, along with some really bad federal level things, but also potentially some really good federal things. But we're going to have to just still push for it to not get past the filibuster, because almost certainly there's no way we could get enough votes to get the bad parts amended out. So that's what we're going to be keeping an eye on, and we'll be communicating with folks about. Unfortunately, we don't know the timing on that, but in the meantime, we will be sharing with you all a follow-up email with materials, with these slides, with a number of informational materials that we have. We're also going to continue this Lunch and Learn series. We had our first one that dealt with the police reforms. Our next one will be on bail and pretrial detention in DC and the threats to that from Congress and the administration. Once again, there are many different threats, and we're trying to highlight some of the ones that we think are likely the priorities, but it is hard to know. And that's a technique, right? Is throw as many negative things at you as possible in order to make it harder to push back on all of them. In terms of making sense of the bigger picture, you can also check out our DC Justice Library article, where we talk more about DC statehood and and the current status that we have, all the different ways in which the federal government interferes with DC, and choices by the federal government make DC less safe and less free. In terms of how to engage, we're getting this information out there. It's very important for people to have it. Just even understanding what's going on is the first step, but there'll be plenty of opportunities to get involved. Our first ask of you is to share this information with friends, with colleagues, family, including in places that have voting members of Congress, that have senators, right? Like, as I mentioned, the Senate is probably going to be the chance for us to stop this. The more people that know about this, the more people talking about it, the better. The more people that can say, if they overhear a conversation about mandatory minimums, no, actually, those are not helpful. They don't make us safer, the better. So spread the word. Keep an eye out for calls to action on our social media and in our emails. We'll be following up when the time comes. As I mentioned, the timing's not clear on when that bill might even become an official thing in the Senate, much less when a vote will get scheduled. But those things happen very quickly. And so as soon as we get the word about them, we'll be, reaching out, we'll be putting on social media, we'll be sending out an email blast saying, this is what's happening, here's what's in the bill, here's what you can do to push back. Also, as I've said a couple times, there are unfortunately many, many attacks on DC right now, and there's lots of different groups, lots of different opportunities to get involved. And so we really encourage you to do something. It's I was watching a talk by someone the other day that was very powerful to me, where she was talking about how in this moment we can feel we're taking in all this negative information and we can feel like we're not doing enough, and it can make us want to like just tune it all out. But actually, the antidote is not to get less information, although maybe managing information is good, but is actually to do something. And that even the smallest thing you do actually can help you feel like, okay, I'm engaging in this, I'm making a change, I'm pushing back on all this negativity that I'm seeing. So definitely encourage folks to check out any of the myriad opportunities that are out there for getting involved and pushing back on these attacks on our beautiful and amazing city that we love so much. So we wanted to open it up here to see what questions folks might have about the larger topic of mandatory minimums, what they look like in DC, or these bills in Congress or other threats from Congress or from the administration towards DC on this. So we'll go ahead and open it up here. We've also listed these resources. As I mentioned, we will share out these slides, and we'll also share out the links to all these resources. If you want to, let's go ahead and if you want to unmute and ask a question. If we got too many people, if people want to raise their hands on the Zoom function, that would be great. Maybe I'll go ahead and start with this question I saw in the chat, and then Lanai, I saw you unmuted, so I'll go to you next. Can you explain more fully why mandatory minimums do not benefit victims? If mandatory minimums harm victims, can you explain? Ashley, do you feel like you could take a first go at addressing this?
Yes, and then feel free to add anything I might have missed. So there are victim advocacy groups in DC that are opposed to the use of mandatory minimums because mandatory minimums takes away something that if when courts are not bound by mandatory minimums, they're required to consider, like the victim's perspective. And so when you have a mandatory minimum, it kind of removes that part of the process of determining sentencing by removing the way in which victims are supposed to, by the DC code, talk about they have victims' rights and responsibilities, and they're supposed to be able to share their perspective in the sentencing project. So that is one of the reasons why victim organizations are opposed to the use of mandatory minimums. And I think as well it's important to note that there are victims who do not want these punitive things like sentencing and incarceration, and that takes away the opportunity for them to voice that and to have that considered within the sentencing process. Darby, have anything else to add about that?
Well, I would just reemphasize the point you made earlier as well about, in particular in the piece around harming victims, is that oftentimes many people that have committed violence have themselves been victims of violence and survivors of violence. And what we see, and you highlighted how, particularly with mandatory minimums around murder, and there have been some very high profile cases around this, where someone may have killed someone who's abusing them, who's hurting them, and then when there's that mandatory minimum, you cannot take that into account. Not to excuse the action, right? But to understand that as a mitigating factor, as tailoring that sentence to the action that the person took, which is one of the bedrock principles of sentencing, is that it should be tailored to the circumstances of the case, of the crime. And so it actually very much does harm victims who do cause harm by taking away the ability of a judge to use their discretion and to say, okay, on the one hand, yes, you did harm this person, you did kill this person. On the other hand, there are all these mitigating circumstances about why you did that, that with a mandatory minimum, you just can't do.
Thank you, Darby. I also wanted to note I put in the chat a link from our friends that formerly known as Network for Victim Recovery of DC, now known as Volare, that talked a little bit more about why them as a victims advocacy organization are opposed to the use of mandatory minimum. And it just lays out all the things that we've talked about in this Lunch and Learn. So I just wanted to share that resource.
And also amplify what Michaela from the Coalition Against Domestic Violence put in the chat too in response to that question. Thank you, Michaela.
Lanai?
Hi, happy Friday, everyone. So my question is about does DC have a legal standing like for lawsuits? Because it seems as though, I mean, that's because our mandatory minimums are such higher than everyone else's, and 9 out of 10 Black people that are arrested in DC get the mandatory minimums. It definitely feels like a racial bias. Like, is there a legal standard for DC to sue in order to be able to get mandatory minimums again? Because what you say that Ohio like 5 years compared to our 25, like that's outlandish. And to me, it seems like because we have a high population of Black people here compared to those other states that have lower mandatory minimums. Am I making sense with my question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. So there might be situations in which Congress or the federal government takes action that we can challenge through a lawsuit. And we've actually seen that over the past year and actually and prior to that as well, right? Most recently, I'm thinking about, excuse me, I'm thinking about the challenge to the National Guard deployment in DC, right? We could challenge that. We cannot challenge Congress passing laws that would repeal or rewrite our laws. Congress has that authority. They're allowed to do it. Should they do it? No. Do they have to do it? No. You'll see some members of Congress say, oh, it's our constitutional duty. No, that's not accurate. But it is a power that they have under the Constitution and even under the Home Rule Act. So that we cannot challenge. The other part of it is that some of these mandatory minimums, some of them were passed into law before we had home rule, so they were written by Congress. Some of them were written by DC, by our council and mayor. And that's a policy choice that our policymakers have chosen to make over the years. They've also made the policy choice in 2022 to remove all of them except for the one regarding murder. And even that, I think, was adjusted. And yet, since then, we've also seen policy choices to implement new mandatory minimums or to implement policies that exacerbate the harm of mandatory minimums. So there are definitely this. So this particular piece of it falls outside of a challenge that could happen in court. This is more a policy question, and it's a question both of what Congress does and pushing back on that, but also reminding our local policymakers and that our representatives, those who are elected by us, that they need to be making the right policy choices and not be at least not be increasing the harms of these mandatory minimum sentences, ideally be reducing them. I hope that helps to address that question.
Thank you.
And in terms of, if you pull back just a tiny bit more and look at it, the bigger picture of like, I mean, there's injustice here, obviously, right? And there's racial injustice in particular. Unfortunately, it's pretty well established under Supreme Court precedents that this kind of thing does not qualify as cruel or unusual punishment. So that would be perhaps the other way to challenge it, but that is also not really an option. Yes, absolutely. I appreciate that note in the chat that in a number of states there's lobbying from conservative groups to decrease incarceration because it is extremely expensive and does not necessarily produce the public safety results that people claim that it would. And in fact, both mandatory minimums, maybe not always, but in many cases, have been opposed by folks on all parts of the political spectrum. And the escape valve policy approach of creating some sort of way to mitigate or exempt from mandatory minimums in certain cases. That also has gotten widespread support across a political spectrum. So that is also even more frustrating that Congress would be targeting these things when it's gotten support. What we see happen is that Congress will go after policies that even maybe might be supported in their state, regardless, because they don't see any downside to attacking DC. And they get in the headlines, they get to say, oh, I voted for, tough on crime policies. I voted to lock up violent people, what have you, or attack their opponents by saying they didn't vote for it. They voted to let, killers out or let them off with a slap on the wrist, right? And so it's very much many of these attacks on DC, and we've even seen reporting there's actually complaints among some members of Congress about these bills because they're really messaging bills. They're not going to actually help anybody in any of these states represented by these senators and these representatives, but what they will do is give them a talking point to use. Any other questions out there? Fantastic. Well, those were great. Thank you so much, everyone, for those questions and for weighing in the chat with some excellent insights. Go ahead.